Welcome to the latest of our Blue Deal debates, where we discuss our seas, our fishing industry, and our marine environment. I'm Chris Davies. I'm a former chair of the European Parliament's Fisheries Committee and a senior advisor to Wood Pedersen Public Affairs in Brussels. Today, we're going to take a close look at the Marine Stewardship Council, whose blue logo appears on some 20,000 fish products across the world. The MSC aims, it says, to recognise and reward sustainable fishing practices by influencing the choices made when people buy seafood. Its logo may be blue, but by the standards of many, it is regarded as the gold standard when it comes to identifying sustainable seafood. Yet the organisation has come under criticism from some environmentalists who claim that the bar is not always set as high as it should be when those standards are set. So let me be clear. Today's webinar is sponsored by the MSC because its people want an opportunity to explain what they do and how they do it, and they also want a chance to respond to some of the criticisms. And to that end, I have complete freedom to ask whatever questions I want, and I certainly intend to exercise that freedom. But if you wish to add to the points, to the questions, then use the facility here to email in some additional points, and I'll try to get to them before we reach the end of our debate. So let me introduce my guests. Camiel Derichs, who is the Programme Development Director for MSC, Rohan Currey, Chief Science and Standards Officer, and Erin Priddle, the Regional Director for Northern Europe. So welcome to you all. Let me first of all turn to Camiel, frequent visitor to these Blue Deal debates, our third time, I think, Camiel. And you've also been with MSC longer. I think you've been with MSC for 15 years, longer than your colleagues. So tell me, how did MSC come about? What was the purpose?
Well, first of all, thanks, Chris, for having me on the panel again. But where to start? I mean, the MSC was obviously created in the mid-90s. It was created at the time when the global overfishing problem became an increasingly big commercial problem for some of the world's largest fish processing companies that were buying a lot of whitefish, when the Grand Banks fisheries for cod on the east coast of Canada and the US essentially collapsed to a level where some of these very large whitefish producers, whitefish product makers, were confronted with a sourcing problem, and the managers in the company, which was owned by Unilever at the time, Frozen Fish International, they were looking at an assurance mechanism to avoid that they would source from unsustainable fisheries. They wanted to avoid the brand risk, but also wanted to make sure that they could continue to source indefinitely. And they very soon recognized that they couldn't do this all by themselves. They were and are commercially interested as an organization, and they felt that this needed to be based on independent science. They needed to work with environmentalists, and therefore they teamed up with the World Wildlife Fund, the world's largest environmental organization, and jointly they essentially facilitated the process of setting the standard, which later became known as the MSC Standard for Sustainable Fishing. So that was sort of the birth of the MSC, where the world's largest environmental organization and a big industry said we need to do something about global overfishing, and we're going to create a tool that helps with that, a market-based tool that recognizes and rewards sustainable fisheries and enables consumers to contribute to solving this problem. That is, in a nutshell, the history. Okay,
thank you. I may say that you do sound as though you're on a trawler being hit by waves, so let's assume that is the case. And we'll assume you're staying remarkably stationary during this process. But, I remember the press release that came from Unilever and WWF in 1996, which announced the launch of the MSC, and I cheered it. But it's interesting. I was watching the film Seaspiracy just the other day, and it said that Unilever had a conflict of interest in forming the MSC. Now, of course, Unilever said at the time it was concerned that it would not be able to supply fish to its customers in 100 years' time because we were overfishing and depleting all the stocks. I mean, I can't imagine anything that was less of a conflict of interest. Surely it was a bringing together of the concept of sustainability with commercial priorities. And that's all to the good, isn't it?
I believe so, and I think Unilever, it is a commercial organization, not a philanthropic organization.
The MSC.
Now I'm talking about Unilever at the time, and still today, obviously, it's a commercially interested organization, and they want to continue to source forever. They want to be able to build their brands, but they also recognize they're not experts in fishery science or ecology. And they do needed to bring credibility to an initiative like this, and that's exactly why they made it a multi-stakeholder initiative with strong rooting in science, with environmental organizations involved, and WWF being involved. So,
well, nearly 25 years on, what have you accomplished?
A lot. The standards initially were a set of principles and criteria, and a very small guide actually to help auditors to apply that on fisheries. And it was really a theory; it wasn't proven in practice. And the theory of change, that recognition of fisheries in the market would generate some sort of value. Well, it was a bit of a gamble at the time. It was some sort of a concept established with the Forestry Stewardship Council that started to show some traction, that was formed 2 years before the MSC. But now, 25 years on, we see that this theory of change is actually working. We've attracted, through the engagement of markets, more than 400 fisheries in the MSC program. Some 17% of global fisheries are engaged in a program, either certified or in the full assessment process, or suspended. We call that still engaged, because these fisheries do have action plans that enable them to come to performance levels where they can meet the standard again. To make it pure, then about 13% of global wild catch currently meets the MSC standard and is certified and eligible to sell the products into certified supply chain. So that's the supply side. But that engagement of fisheries largely came about because the market started to value sustainability, wanted to have an independent verification of that, and numerous retailers have built that into their procurement policies. So MSC or equivalent is part of their procurement policies and has attracted, I would say, some 18,000 MSC labeled products now that you mentioned in the introduction that we can find on the shelves of the label.
Right. Well, let me stop you there, because you've raised a lot of issues which we've got to come back to. But one, of course, was you said that MSC is currently labeling as sustainable about 13% of the world's fish catch. Now, is that good or bad? I mean, because it's well below the target you had set yourself, your aspirations, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, you're right. We would love to be all fisheries to meet that sustainability standard. That would be the ideal place to go for global fisheries management. The reality is the MSC sets a high bar, and so many fisheries do not meet it yet. 87% currently is not certified. And we hope that that high bar and the market engagement is incentivizing fisheries to make improvement to come to that level of performance. And that's essentially the last thing I wanted to say also in my previous answer. What have we accomplished? We use the market as a tool. It is a means to an end. But ultimately, what drives this program and what we're created for is to create impacts in the water and on fisheries management, to create incentives to drive fisheries management improvement. And in that, MSC is a tool in the toolbox. There's an incredible large number of tools where governments obviously are the key stewards of the shared resources, that they need to set the regulation that fishermen need to operate under. They set the tax. The MSC is not a fisheries management agency. NGOs that are engaged with the market or are campaigning to point out issues, they have a different tool set than the MSC, and it complements. And collectively, the sustainable seafood movement, where MSC has been part of the trailblazers, has, I think, accomplished a lot.
Thank you. Let me turn to Erin and just say, I'm a former legislator. When I think about sustainability, I think about introducing controls on fishermen. But the whole way in which the MSC works is to try and work with fishermen to improve practice and to give them an incentive to do so. So how does this come about on a practical level? Do the fishermen approach the MSC, or do you approach the fishermen?
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here. It can happen either way. Sometimes we have fishery outreach managers who are active in the field, and they can just assess, potential fisheries that could be good candidates for the program. But often we do get approached as well for fisheries who are interested in entering the MSC program. So it can really happen either or. I think if you kind of look at the sort of market-based model and the incentive structure, and I've worked with government, I've worked with other NGOs, and in my experience, I've only been 2 or 3 years now with, coming up to 3 years with the MSC. But in my experience, actually putting fishermen at the heart of the sustainability issue will deliver results in a more profound way than other tactics like the command and control sometimes of regulatory systems. Now I worked with DEFRA for 10 years, so I can speak to the benefits of policy as well. But I think having the way our standard works, principle 3, of course, is grounded in governance and good management. So having that framework for regulatory support alongside a voluntary system like the MSC creates an environment where fishermen, if they wish to, can enter our program and demonstrate their credibility and their sustainability on the water.
Okay, so why do they wish to? Why would they wish to? I mean, is there a really encouraging financial incentive, for example? Or?
Sure, there's a plethora of reasons. I think often fishermen want to join our program because it is recognition of their practices that are sustainable. It can give them market access. There are socioeconomic benefits in terms of reliability of access to market. It's also because fishermen, and I've spoken with many fishermen now, often they're vilified for the activities that they engage with, their profession. But many of them actually, they want to carry this profession into the future for their children and their children's children. So, often our fishermen, we call them ocean heroes. And I think they are inspired and incentivized to want to join the MSC program to demonstrate they're, one of the good guys, that they want fish for future generations. And that's what our program is about.
Well, okay. Some would think of fishermen tend to be more akin to hunter-gatherers, chasing every last fish, than people who are really putting the future of the planet in the front of their sights.
Well, maybe we should take you down to the dock sometime. And I think often some of the younger fishermen, let's say, often they have to do sustainability courses. I mean, I think the sector has advanced so much in the past, number of decades. But even in the last 10 years, I think a lot of these guys now, they are looking at it through a different lens.
I don't understand, though. I mean, one of the criticisms of MSC is that I'm not sure. Are you an NGO or a commercial organization, a non-profit making commercial organization with sustainability as its motivation?
We're an NGO. We're a non-governmental organization. We're not a profit-making organization.
But you get attacked. You get attacked by people say what the MSC is interested in is getting as many products certified as possible because they make money out of licensing their label. So the more products that can be classified as sustainable, the more money that the MSC makes, the bigger the organization becomes, and therefore standards start slipping.
What the MSC is interested in is our mission and vision, which is ending overfishing and having our oceans teeming with life. That's our mission and vision. It's not products on shelf. That's a consumer-facing offer that demonstrates that that product has come from a verified sustainable source. And so, this is where this kind of commercial criticism does come into the debate sometimes. But no, at the heart of MSC, we are a mission-driven organization with a vision to end overfishing.
Well, do you actually get fishermen to change their ways and improve? I mean, are you simply licensing the existing? It's only 13% after all. Are you simply licensing the already good practitioners?
So
or are you getting fishermen to change their ways and adopt sustainability where that wasn't the case hitherto?
Sure. I'll say again, we provide this framework, the 28 progress indicators that fishermen need to demonstrate that they're meeting against, and Rohan will get into this later, I'm sure, around the standard. So yeah, I mean, through that, fishermen have to basically demonstrate their kind of credibility and, their commitment to the program. And the way that it works is that there can be conditions set against those fisheries in terms of improvements that need to be made along the way. And they have 5 years to be able to demonstrate that. And we have an independent audit system that can come in and verify that at certain points along the way to ensure that that progress is happening. But this is a journey. This is where I think and it's great that we can, myth bust a bit here today, because when fisheries are certified, they have to demonstrate, where they're going to get to through that 5-year journey. And that will include condition closing around various things like ETP and bycatch. So, you know, this is kind of where we're bringing fishermen along towards that journey to an endpoint where that fishery is in a really good, I guess, amazing sustainability at the end of that 5-year journey. And then if not, you know, the certifiers can withdraw or can suspend that fishery.
So fishermen really are, when they sign up to the MSC, they really are changing their practices and promoting sustainability in a way that perhaps they weren't before.
What I'd like to give you is a case study of a fishery that I have always been a bit captivated by, the Poole Harbour clam and cockle fishery. There was rife IUU, illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing going on in that fishery. There was overfishing. They teamed up with the local Inshore Fishery and Conservation Authority. They committed to the program. They sought some funding. This is a small-scale fishery, and they basically, through committing to the program, completely eliminated IUU, completely eliminated overfishing, and have some of the kind of best, most credible shellfish that are going out to market now. And those guys are so proud of what they've achieved. And I think that's what the program gives. And sometimes it's nice to illustrate that through a case study or an example of a fishery that is really committed and has come along the way and are speaking to national press even about, you know, the journey that they've been on and what MSC has done for them.
Thank you very much. Okay, Rohan, Chief Standards and Science Officer, the standards, 28 different criteria or something that Erin mentioned here. Where do these standards come from? Are they back of an envelope?
It's an excellent question, Chris, and good to be here and part of this. The standards themselves originally arose, as Camiel alluded to, from a set of principles and criteria. They came from the FAO eco-labelling guidelines, which were a way to try to put into practice what the original sort of code of conduct for responsible fisheries had codified. So the FAO laid this down more than 20 years ago now as a principle as to how sustainable fisheries can and should operate. We have then turned that into a set of standards which then apply across all fisheries that are able to operate globally. And every few years, we have periodic standard reviews. So those original sort of principles and criteria that were then refined and turned into globally applicable standards are then able to be evolved to reflect the way that best practice moves around the world. So it's from that DNA that comes from the FAO approach that has then been evolved to reflect the way the world has changed since then.
Okay. And how do you enforce the standards?
So the standards are applied by independent auditors. Obviously, it's a voluntary program. So as Erin alluded to, you will have fisheries that might wish to be certified. They will then engage with a conformity assessment body. The independent assessment team is then formed, and these experts then conduct an assessment. That assessment is quite a rigorous process. It typically involves a site visit. It involves multiple rounds of stakeholder comments. It involves peer review. It involves an opportunity for the fishery itself to comment on the draft findings. And at the end of the process, if there are any stakeholder concerns, there is the possibility of objecting to a fisheries assessment outcome. And then there are hearings held as part of that process, and there's binding arbitration by an independent adjudicator. So that process is quite rigorous and intensive. In some cases for fisheries, it's taken more than a year. In fact, in the early days, it had taken several years for some of our assessments. But these days, it typically takes about 9 months to 12 months to undergo that process. Then after a fishery is assessed, and if it's deemed to be certified, then it is able to be part of the program for the duration of the time that they have that certificate, which is 5 years. And every year, they will then undergo an annual surveillance audit. And also, if at any other point in time new information comes to light that indicates they may not meet the standard, they can be subject to an expedited audit. So they're expected to meet the standard, prove it to a very high standard, and then continue to maintain that with a high degree of confidence.
Okay, well, that sounds very impressive. But, you know, I read the criticisms of various environmentalists that say that the standards aren't as tough as you make out, that certain practices such as deep sea bottom trawling, for example, and excessive bycatch, some of these things are tolerated where they really shouldn't be if you are genuinely committed to sustainability. I mean, are the standards tough enough?
It's an excellent question. In terms of trying to set a level of performance that's expected, it is quite a challenging process to work out what is good enough. We have a few important principles that sit behind that. One is we evolve our standards where we see new evidence and widely adopted changes in fisheries management best practice. So that is our bar, that is our threshold. We expect to reflect the best of the way that the world behaves, but where it has been successfully adopted and implemented by fisheries management agencies. So we're not necessarily seeking to reflect the latest science that just has appeared in Nature last week, but we're also not expecting to lag behind where management best practice has evolved and been reflected for many years. So we're trying to calibrate that appropriately. And it's partly because the MSC is a recognition program. We're seeking to recognise where people have done this. As Erin also alluded to, we're seeking to drive change. Many of the fisheries that enter and seek certification, they attract conditions. So that means that they have to make required improvements. More than 90% of fisheries in the program have had conditions on initial certification. And that then means those fisheries have to make changes even after they've already met our standard. So our bar is high and it encourages continuous improvement. That's not to say there aren't areas we can improve. We have our regular standard reviews, our periodic standard reviews, where we look to engage with stakeholders and make sure the bar is set appropriately. And in those cases, we go through, again, a very rigorous process to make sure we've reflected what the latest evidence says, we engage with our stakeholders, we think about the consequences of changes to our program and the impact of it, and then we look to apply those over time consistent with what the FAO requires.
Well, one of the criticisms is that your process is, pretty cumbersome, and also, it requires a very considerable investment of effort at the very least, and that frankly, small-scale, low-impact fishermen, just simply haven't got the resources to get involved in the MSC process.
It's a fair critique that it is difficult for some fisheries to actually reach our standard. That's sometimes about a level of performance. It's also sometimes about the resourcing and the market links. When we've looked into the issue of small-scale fishery engagement in our program, we find that small-scale fisheries are able to engage, and in fact, we do have a number of small-scale fisheries in our program, but they may not be as common as larger-scale fisheries. And part of that is the market links aren't necessarily as strong, or maybe the governance in their particular locations where many of those small-scale fisheries isn't yet necessarily at a stage where it would be able to pass parts of our standard. So this might reflect the level of performance of that fishery hasn't yet met that level. What we do find, though, is that there are ways to incentivise improvement there, and we've produced many tools to help support those fisheries. So we undertake capacity building in those areas. We've produced risk-based assessment methodologies to enable people to be assessed in places where they don't have as much information as they might have in the developed world. So there are a lot of possibilities there that we've explored to try to create a pathway for those fisheries to come forward if they wish to be certified.
Here's a quote from the film Seaspiracy, which I looked at again yesterday. "Despite countless fisheries becoming depleted, I could only find a couple where certification had been denied in over 20 years.
So, sorry, could you repeat the quote?
That was the quote. It was about the MSC. Despite countless fisheries becoming depleted, I'm not sure that's the case at all. I could only find a couple where certification had been denied in over 20 years.
I think it's a question as to what the person who has provided that quote actually deemed to be depleted. I would question whether that's actually factually accurate. So the MSC standard requires that the fisheries meet a level of performance in terms of their management of target species. That means that they're maximising the productivity of the stock. They're looking to maximise the yield that is able to be obtained, which means that we're able to feed the world and maintain those fisheries populations in a healthy state. So that's the expectation in terms of our performance. There are certain circumstances where fisheries might have for reasons of fluctuations in things like recruitment, they might have a temporary dip in stock status, in which case we expect them to rebuild. And that's simply because it's not possible to predict all the environmental fluctuations that happen.
But you have how many fisheries have you decertified over the years? or suspended?
A number of fisheries have been suspended. As Camiel alluded to, there are currently 17% of global fisheries in the program, but only 13% of them can currently use the MSC eco label. And that's because some quite large volume fisheries have been deemed to be ineligible to use the eco label at present because they no longer meet our standard. And in some cases, that's because their stock status is not necessarily in the shape it could be. In other cases, it's because their management hasn't been responsive. So we take that very seriously.
Okay, absolutely crucial to the MSC is the credibility of the logo, obviously, because you've got a selling operation here. You've got to attract fishermen into the program, and you've got if you can't get retailers to license your logo, your product, then there's no incentive for fishermen to get involved in the first place. Is that the case, Erin? Can I turn to you? I mean, are you dealing with the retailers too? How do you get the retailers on board? Because clearly the majority of fish being sold globally doesn't have the MSC logo attached to it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, retailers have their own CSR policies, and with respect to seafood sustainability, they want to have some sort of verification that that product has come from a sustainable, fully verified fishery. And that's where the MSC can provide that full traceability. So we haven't touched on our chain of custody standard, but basically we are able to offer that assurance. The fish product that retailer receives or a customer receives can be traced back to source. And we're the only seafood sustainability certification program in the world that has that component. And that's, part of why retailers do want to, be partners with the MSC because of that verification. They all have their different CSR policies, as I mentioned, and some are MSC, but some go beyond that as well. Some are, around tuna fisheries might have a fad-free policy. So it's really up to them in terms of the policies that they set. But we help kind of fulfill that policy or CSR need around independently verified seafood.
But if you're a normal person, you want to buy sustainable seafood, it is still enormously difficult. I mean, in Northern Europe, which of course is your region, I think we have the highest penetration of certified seafood in supermarkets. Yeah. But there's still an awful lot of supermarkets, retailers which aren't stocking sustainable seafood, and in some cases, some is and some isn't. You're going to look at every can, every product before you know what you're buying. Why are there still so many retailers who 25 years on just don't get the message that sustainability matters?
I think retailers have, really come leaps and bounds in terms of, fulfilling their due diligence around a number of issues, including sustainability. So I think it's been much better, but you're right. I mean, I think with 13% able to offer that, front of pack label, that's a very small percentage of the world seafood. And we have, 9 billion people on this planet and an extraordinary need to fulfill a protein source via seafood. And so, providing that verification to consumers is important. We fill, a niche there in terms of, the MSC, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot that isn't verified. And I think that's for consumers, they're faced with a lot of purchasing decisions, a lot of different labels on pack. And I think for us, we have really good consumer recognition, particularly in North Europe and particularly in countries like in the Scandinavian area where recognition rates are really high, up to 70%. So we've been, very embedded in that sort of culture, and the consumer demand is high there.
Everyone campaigning on these issues, though, needs to be putting more pressure on the retailers. Because if the retailers aren't saying we insist upon our fish being from a sustainable source, then sure, the whole incentive collapses, isn't it? It's just not there.
Yeah, I mean, retailers are held to account by NGOs, through regulation and other means. So we're part of, this puzzle that we need to put together around sustainability in seafood and forestry and all kinds of other commodity production. And consumers are evolving too. I think we're in an era now of, highly demanding, eco-conscious consumers. You've alluded to documentary making, not just in seafood, but in other commodity production as well. Climate change is a massive issue. People want to know. They want to have transparency around the products that they buy. They want traceability, and we're able to offer that. But again, it is just a certain percentage. So yeah.
Are you trying to get more fishermen on board? About more than 13%. If the retailers are insisting we will only buy sustainably sourced food, and you have got to prove to us that it's sustainably sourced, then obviously MSC does well, but sustainability does well. But it's again it's what really drives forward the fishermen. Camiel, one question for you, because looking globally, I see that from the annual report of the MSC that Peruvian anchovies, one of the biggest single catches in the world. Even though they're not sold for human consumption, they're sold for fish meal, and yet they've got MSC, in some cases MSC. I mean, why does anyone bother to get MSC accreditation if you're not going to ever come across the consumer?
I don't think, maybe to correct the perception, Peruvian anchovy feta is not MSC certified, but there has been an improvement project that has been reported publicly on fisheries.progress.org that claims that this fishery is improving towards the level where it can meet the MSC standard. Now, if that fishery were to choose to be assessed publicly against the MSC standard, we'd obviously welcome that and give them a chance like any other fishery. And where then the fish goes, whether that's fish meal or fish oil or maybe human consumption, that's not something that is of prime concern. The program of the MSC is focused on fishery sustainability and good fisheries management, and then how it subsequently is used is to a very significant degree up to the supply chain and the market. And to draw a comparison, fisheries in the North Sea targeting species that are used for fish meal or fish oil production have met the MSC standard. Some of it goes into human consumption, some of it goes to fish meal and fish oil, which ends up as an ingredient in feed, for instance, for the salmon or tilapia industry, which also wants to verify that marine ingredients in their feeds originate from well-managed fishery. It's actually a part of the standard of the ASC feed standard, which recently launched. We hope that small pelagic fisheries, which typically provide the raw material for meal and oil production, actually improve the levels where they can meet the MSC standard, because frankly, they are at the heart of the ecosystem, the small pelagic, and in many cases do need to generate improvements to sustain fisheries and communities and ultimately supply chain.
Thanks, Camiel. Rohan, you were discussing and defending vigorously the MSC standards, but if a normal consumer goes to the shop, then okay, they can look for the MSC label, which they may or may not find on their products, but they will also find a whole lot of other conflicting eco labels. Dolphin friendly, for example, or responsibly sourced. I have no idea what responsibly sourced means. I mean, how do people know that the MSC logo is the best? What do you think of these other logos? I mean, what sort of rigor goes into enforcing and ensuring they mean something?
It's an excellent question, and I think the reality is we've mapped out hundreds of different claims and self-certifications and ratings and tips. There's an incredible amount of things done nowadays to somehow give a particular credential to a seafood product. And very few, I'm aware of any, that are at the level of the MSC, meeting all of the ICO codes of practice in terms of stakeholder involvement, transparency, good governance, impact generation, whole assurance system that sits behind it with the traceability. So the reality is we don't really know what responsible means. The assurance mechanisms are often not very robust, to be very frank. And I really think that needs to be called out. And that where it comes to retailers, Erin just alluded to it, that there's a lot of engagement from retailers in Northern Europe, and they have typically recognized MSC as an important assurance mechanism in their procurement policies. We need to see that example to be followed, and we need the NGO community to hold market actors to account. That when responsible sourced or other types of claims emerge, can they actually be verified? is that something that is standing the scrutiny of proper assurance like we offered through the MSC program?
Okay, as the waves hit your boat, Camiel, let me just stop for a second, as we're about halfway through our first discussion, and you've just been hearing from Camiel Derichs, the Programme Development Director of the Marine Stewardship Council, and with me also is Rohan Currey, Chief Science and Standards Officer, and Erin Priddle, the Regional Director for North Europe. Erin, coming, but you've worked for the Environmental Defence Fund. I mean, all of you three, you've all got a background in marine degrees and sustainability, and I mean, some of your critics are environmental NGOs you probably went to university, but you're probably on the same course with them. You're exactly the same people. You could switch from an NGO to them, and they could switch from an NGO to you. It's interesting that there was this sort of family dispute, really. All of you are committed to sustainability. What did you say? What's the object of the MSC? You want to see oceans teeming with life,
and don't we all? Okay. Right? And
I think go on, Erin, please.
Well, that's the conversation I think to have with our NGO comrades is that we're all in this together. We all want the same end goal. I just see it as a spectrum, and we all want to get here, and we're somewhere here, and we have different tools in the box, don't we? So NGOs have different advocacy tools, different engagement tools, and the MSC comes with its own suite of tools. And I think this change and this issue is so big that we're faced with. I think we've got accelerated climate impacts. We're seeing fish moving their jurisdictions faster than ever before. I mean, we have ocean acidification, we have overfishing, we have so many issues on our plate. And for me, I think that we need to actually work together because the challenge is so big. We'll never do it on our own. So it would be great to find those ways that we can work with others. And for myself, yes, coming from Environmental Defence Fund, that was an NGO that actually really saw the value of the market-based approach and working with fishermen, working with markets to get environmental outcomes at scale. And that's something that the MSC does. It does work with large scale industries. It does look to try and scale the response to the issue that we're all faced with right now.
I have some detailed questions that have been put to me by various NGOs, which I'll be putting to some of you during the course of our discussion. Rohan, let me just turn to you again, though, just on the standards and the label and the alternative labels that exist. I mean, you're the one who's out there trying to ensure that the MSC label is the gold standard. What do you think of all these other claims that are being made? I mean, why are they tolerated? Why hasn't someone stepped in? When the European Union, for example, bans them, we ban false claims on all sorts of food products. After all,
it's a good question, Chris. I think the challenge that we face is that a lot of people are looking for different things when they're looking to make a claim, basically. So they come to it with a particular set of values of things that they particularly care about. So it'd far be it for me to comment on the motives behind others and establishing their own schemes. I think provided people understand what they actually stand for and what they're trying to achieve, I'm comfortable with other schemes existing. I think the reality is, though, we should understand what those schemes represent. And one of the best ways to identify that and evaluate that is to go through a benchmarking exercise. Camiel alluded to this a little bit, but one of the most recognised benchmarks is the Global Sustainable Seafood Initiative's benchmarking tool, which goes back to the original FAO principles and criteria and says this is what an eco-label should actually cover if you want to talk about sustainable fisheries activity. The MSC is the only standard that's been benchmarked against that and found to not only meet all the required criteria, but to meet many of the supplementary criteria in addition. And we cover more than any other eco-label in this space. In addition to that, we have our assurance system. And as we've alluded to, this rigorous assessment process and the independence that goes with it. So I'm quite comfortable with others putting claims out there, provided they are comfortable being able to back that up and talk about how they deliver assurance as well. And so So from my perspective, scrutiny on standard setters and assurance is entirely appropriate. Stakeholders can and should be doing that. I just hope that people are applying the same level of scrutiny to all actors in this space and questioning what stands behind every label that they encounter. Because we're more than happy to talk about what our label stands for and why we believe it's a credible claim, the ISEAL principles that we follow, and all of the work that we've done over 20 years to build up to the point where we can stand behind it. I think that's a fair question to ask of others as well.
Thank you. I'll come back to you. Camiel, I want to look at the development of the MSC and its impact upon the global position. It's perhaps asking a lot for one organisation to try and transform the world. I mean, many of the policy changes we need are matters that need to be resolved by governments through legislation, through national initiatives, and through the regional fisheries management organisations and the like. They can't simply fall back on a standard-setting organisation to do it. Still, you have high hopes. I mean, one of your aspirations, for example, was that I think 20% of the global catch would be MSC certified by 2020, and perhaps a third of the global catch by 2030. And in practice, you're quite a way behind that. Now, how do we step things up? I mean, I understand, for example, you've been talking with the financial institutions and the like about how they can be insisting upon sustainability when money for capital projects is handed out.
Capital markets will be playing a role, I think, have to play a role, but maybe to give a simple answer to your question, how can we make real progress? There's one word that comes to my mind, which is collaboration. And this is all about sending the right messages and collaborating across a spectrum of different types of stakeholders. NGOs working in the market and through advocacy, as well as legislators being on occasion more responsible and perhaps taking very hard decisions to cut quota in order to allow stocks to recover. Adoption of harvest strategies and harvest control rules require a lot of science, a lot of data collection and analysis and modeling to substantiate decision-making at RFMO level, so the scientific community needs to be involved. Markets need to accommodate that transition to a better and higher performance level of fisheries and fisheries management by not necessarily opting for the cheapest supply, but opting for what is sustainable and paying the right price. Now, there's an incredible amount of stakeholders that need to come together to collaborate, to establish ultimately fisheries management at a higher level, so we can continue to feed more mouths as the world expands. And then coming back to your segue into the capital markets and what role they play. Obviously, money is sort of the oil, the lubricant of the global economy. Fishing vessel owners that need to replace a vessel typically take a mortgage and need to pay that back. Now, if they get that money under the condition that they need to use that vessel to participate in fisheries that are sustainable, that can demonstrate that have been independently verified to meet the standard, then that creates easier access to capital. And that easier access to capital, or under better conditions, perhaps favorable loan conditions with lower discount rates, that creates an additional incentive next to the market incentive that's there and that we need to strengthen to help fisheries move in the right direction. So that capital market engagement, in my mind at least, starts to be an important part of the value proposition of certification, next to what markets are already offering in terms of an incentive.
What about engagement with the really big fish producers, the companies that own fishing fleets or have big contracts with fishing fleets, especially in the tuna sector? Now, I know MSC does well here. I mean, I think 28% of the world's tuna is MSC certified. But there's some seriously big companies here, some of whom have got a commitment to sustainability or to move towards sustainability. Thai Union, for example, has been on a Blue Deal debate before now to put their case. But there's others which are, no one's ever heard of them. They're bigger. I don't see any evidence that they're trying to do anything to ensure that fish stocks are there for future generations. And yet some people, NGOs have told me, well, we can't campaign against them because no one's ever heard of their names before. They're obscure. And if you don't know their name, you can't campaign. Well, I wonder to what extent you have serious engagement with some of these companies to try and impress upon their their leadership that sustainability is the name of the game.
I think that the large tuna companies or very large vertically integrated seafood companies, I mean, you can find them. They are working together on sustainability under an initiative called CBOS, but you can also find them in, say, a trade media publication from, I believe, under Current News or Intrafish, which every now and then updates a top 100 of biggest seafood companies. So I think within the industry, within this movement, the top companies are pretty well known, and many of these companies have sustainability policies. What I'd be interested in, I'm not sure if that's been looked into in detail, is actually what is the policy, what was it in the past, where is it moving towards, what's the actual performance. It's nice to have policies, but ultimately what matters is what is the performance and what proxies do you use to measure that performance. MSC certification and proportion of the total turnover or catch can serve as a really good indicator on what the performance is of a company. And that's increasingly recognized also by finance actors, I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Right, just one last quick round on the role of fishermen and retailers. I mean, Erin, what's your perception? I mean, difficult question here because also we're talking almost about outside Europe, but how is MSC perceived by these by the biggest retailers? Is it if you want to be involved in sustainability, is MSC the label people automatically going to come to, or do they try and find alternatives, greenwash alternatives, if you like, which allow them to tick a box and say, we're doing the right thing, but in practice not put any effort into making it happen?
MSC is a partner to some of the biggest retailers in Europe and all over the world. So, we're offering a solution again to ensure that they can offer consumers verified, sustainable seafood. But I think increasingly, there's a lot on the retailers' plates as well, not just sustainability, but due diligence and human rights and other aspects, carbon, things like that. So they've got a suite of challenges. And again, we just sort of are an environmental standard sort of offering on the sustainability aspect of seafood. So yeah, I think it's, it's challenging for retailers as well, but increasingly there is quite a plethora of options, I think, for them to pick from. And I think we do need to avoid potential greenwashing with other labels. And this is something the EU is tackling right now. Looking at sort of weeding out unsubstantiated, unverified claims, which, retailers can decide to go with if it's an easy tick box, maybe a declaration. And so I think it's good to see actually, public policy initiatives looking at tackling this because it is rife. I mean, I can't really speak to the global market, but certainly in the EU, this is happening. And this is why policymakers are addressing it. So the MSC and other third-party private verification organizations like the MSC are working with policy initiatives to look at weeding this out.
Thank you, Rohan. I think MSC employs about 300 people globally. I mean, just put us in context. Obviously, Northern Europe, we've just heard from Erin there, is quite well established. But globally, I mean, I look at the annual report and there's examples of MSC certified fisheries across the world, but where are you strongest and where are you weakest?
It's a good question, Chris. So our global presence is quite broad. So in terms of fisheries engagement, we actually have fisheries in many different parts of the world that are engaged. We've traditionally been quite strong with our engagement in North America and Northern Europe, and also across into Australasia. We've seen a lot of fisheries come out of those particular areas, largely in many cases because their fisheries management systems have been quite well developed. They've got strong links to markets and they've been looking to be able to demonstrate their sustainability. In terms of the market, it's very strong in Europe, but I would also say that's broadening. We're now seeing increasing interest in North America and in Asia. And as a result of that growth, I think we're seeing expansion of the program in different parts of the world, partly driven by particular product classes. So we've found this as a sort of phenomena throughout our growth over time, is that as a certain product type, so for example, whitefish, as that becomes more common that fisheries are certified in there then becomes a very strong market demand that other fisheries achieve certification, and that then creates a pressure and a drive. So that you then start to see many fisheries looking to make improvements to reach the level of performance that we would expect to enter the program. And we saw that originally in whitefish, we saw it with pelagics and salmon. Now we're seeing it quite a lot with tuna. So as you mentioned before, our tuna fisheries are more than 20% of global landings, but that has been increasing quite rapidly. And it's largely because there's a very strong market demand for sustainable tuna that seems to be increasing day by day.
Okay. Well, I'm going to turn now to some of the criticisms that have been voiced about MSC by various environmentalists. I know some people would say, look, you're just being too perfectionist here, but the credibility of your label, that it generally meets sustainability in its wider context, I think is obviously crucial to the future of the organisation and to the whole process. So I think some of these issues need to be addressed. Now, a couple of years ago, you were attacked for allowing what's called, I think, compartmentalisation, and this was in a tuna fishery, if I'm correct, that you were allowing tuna to be caught and certified in a sustainable way alongside tuna being caught in a way that wasn't necessarily sustainable. You've addressed that. I understand that. But I don't understand how that was ever allowed in the first place.
So again, it's a very good point, Chris. And that partly goes back to the fact that our program was formulated deliberately to be quite flexible in the way that fisheries could define themselves. This is partly because it's not very straightforward to define precisely what a fishery actually is. The FAO spent many years on this. What we've got there is a sort of a loose collection of terms of things that are associated with fishing activity, such as vessel types, gear types, things like that. So we allowed that flexibility, and partly that was to enable recognition of the sustainable components of a fishery. So there is no one-size-fits-all definition to that. So we allowed different ways for fisheries to define themselves based on their gear type, based on where they operate, based on their fishing practices. And that was the crucial point here, was it was using different practices with the same gear type. It was previously allowed that could be treated as separate fishery components and treated as different units of assessment is the technical term in our standard. And as a result, that enabled parts of fisheries to come forward. So in this case, the parties to the Nauru Agreement, their fishery, which targeted free school skipjack tuna in particular, was able to be certified, while the component that was caught on fads was not. But
you stopped it.
We did, and this
the arguments and
this was a product of a lot of research and a lot of consultation. So we spent a lot of time looking at this issue. The reason why we ultimately decided to not allow separation based on practice, people can still separate based on gear type and other things like that, but they can't separate based on different fishing practices, because we examined our theory of change to find out if fisheries that separated this way over time saw improvements in those different practices. And what we would find is that if you look across different gear types, fisheries that bring in one gear type often improve another gear type and bring that in. Fisheries that certify one species will often bring in another species. This indicates that our theory of change, our drive for improvement, is happening. We didn't see strong evidence for it across different fishing practices. So between that and the strong stakeholder feedback on this, we looked at it and we concluded it didn't make sense to allow fisheries to continue to separate different fishing practices. They now have to certify all their activity with a given gear type. And that then means that all of that activity is then assessed.
I suppose the general question here is people protested against it, campaigners protested against it. You looked at it and eventually changed your approach in order to maintain the credibility of the MSC approach. How many other criticisms that are being made at the moment will you end up finally accepting? Is it not possible for you to get ahead of the game? So I suppose the point is, the criticism is that the bar is too low. Can you not raise it higher now?
It's also partly, Chris, related to the fact that we have a global program and there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach to examining and assessing a fishery. Every fishery is different. And many different fisheries, as they enter the program, highlight new issues that need to be addressed. We have a globally applicable standard. We're deliberately not prescriptive in how people go about achieving the outcomes that we expect. That's intentional. So that's deliberately to create a standard that can be applied across the globe. But it means that not all individual circumstances can be envisaged in advance. Whenever we make changes to our standard, we impact test them so that we can try and understand what the consequences will be. But we don't know the next fishery over the horizon. That's ultimately those kind of, this is the joy of having a third-party system, is having a third-party model for our certification and eco-labelling is MSC doesn't choose which fisheries get certified. The fisheries choose it themselves. And so we encounter these issues. The trick is that we must respond when those issues are raised and follow the evidence. And that's precisely what we did in this case.
Thanks, Rohan. You're not off the hook. I'm going to come back to you, but as we're coming to the end of our first hour of general discussion, let me just put a general point to all three of you, which is, I suppose the aspiration, really. I mean, what realistically, given the current state, 13%, and with the North Atlantic mackerel fishery in the hands of the Icelandic, European, British governments and the like. I mean, what's your aspirations? What's realistic over the next five years? Is MSC going to go from strength to strength? Are you going to bring in many more fishermen, many more fisheries? Erin.
So yeah, speaking about it from a North Europe perspective, you mentioned the mackerel situation. I mean, we have had quite a few suspended fisheries in my region, and so that is showing a theory of change working in practice. And my aspiration is really to hope that these kind of nations come together. The international fisheries governance challenges that are currently really heart and center of being able to get the pelagic fisheries operating, to a high sustainability is basically resolved. But this is just, for me, they're almost like a litmus test for what's happening in RFMOs and tuna fisheries. I think in these kind of highly governed, high information, science-led nations, and there's a responsibility there really to be able to resolve on these issues of governance. And I think as the world changes, we need to have resilient, adaptive management. And the MSC is kind of core to that really in terms of like P3 and being able to demonstrate actually that your management practices are being upheld and applied. So, oceans matter. I think climate change is a big issue. It's impacting on every sort of commodity right now. And I think that's going to be a big kind of question for us as an organization as well, and how we work with other experts in this field to see what the interaction might be with our standards. So I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot to get right still, but I'm excited for the future.
Yeah, the irony of the North Atlantic is, of course, that the EU, the Brits, the Irish, the Icelandics, and the Norwegians all say they're committed to sustainable principles. So they can't get their act together. Quickie from you, Camiel. Hopes and aspirations.
Well, hopes and aspirations, obviously, that fisheries continue to improve and then seek entrance to be recognized in the MSC program, and the markets incentivize that. So zooming out globally, where North Atlantic fisheries management improvement is going to be a driver, I think, to continued growth. So Erin alluded to it, but when markets really show that they're committed to sustainability and ask North Atlantic pelagic seafood to come from management regimes that have essentially improved, stopped their overfishing, which is currently tolerated, that in itself, in the years ahead, can drive substantial re-engagement of fisheries in the program. More globally, I think you will continue to see similar types of need for collaboration to maintain or grow the engagement of tuna fisheries. That's going to be, frankly, very tough. We know that in these multilateral fisheries management environments, where regional fisheries management organizations with 30+ countries having to agree on management measures, on harvest control rules and harvest strategies, to manage shared resources of skipjack, yellowfin, big-eyed tuna, either in the Western Central Pacific or in the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic and the Eastern Tropical Pacific. There is an incredible challenge there, I think, to be addressed. Will that happen? I'm very hopeful. I think actually that we see a global collaborative effort is emerging. We see the Global Tuna Alliance is starting to drive that direction with market actors pushing for fisheries management improvement at RFMO level. ISSF, an industry body, is trying to resonate with that. The MSC is engaged in that process. So I actually think it can be done. It won't be easy, and it won't, with every stock and every management system, be immediately successful. But I think over time we'll continue to see engagement with tuna. And the small pelagics, you hinted on proven anchoveta. I really think that if that FIP has delivered the fishery at a level where some of the public documents on fisheries progress at all indicated is, it may be now interested to move into a public assessment against the standard. That would be a substantial volume, but it would also be an incredible driver for further progress in other small pelagic fisheries that supply raw material for particular feed supply chains. So is there hope? Yes, I think in those three key species groups, you will see probably continued growth. And ultimately then the market needs to show where they are in terms of their commitment to sustainability.
And Rohan, did you make a mistake by joining the MSC?
No, Chris, I moved from the opposite side of the planet and I haven't regretted it to this day. I'm optimistic about our program, and I think Camiel and Erin have outlined why we can be optimistic about that. I am keeping my eye, though, on a couple of issues on the horizon. And I think that the thing that we need to bear in mind is that the enabling environment for sustainable seafood is not a guaranteed prospect. There are things where we need to keep working on that to secure it. And I think the ongoing trials of multilateralism, sort of, I guess, trials and tribulations of multilateral fisheries management is a problem, and it needs to be addressed. We need fisheries management to be taken seriously by countries who, to be frank, have for a long time been thought to be great fisheries managers. They need to put that into practice. And I think we also need to be mindful of the fact that climate change is going to be a real game changer for fisheries management. We're used to managing, in a world where things are more predictable. It's not entirely predictable, but non-linearities associated with climate change are going to present some real difficulties for us to deal with. So I think it's a call to action for us. I think that the MSC is in a good position. It's in a strong position to help and to be part of this. But we need everyone coming together to encourage and make sure that enabling environment actually continues to grow and prosper, because otherwise we've got some work to do, and that will keep us busy for the next few years.
Well, let me really finish this section with one final quote from the film Seaspiracy, where effectively it said that it is not possible to have a sustainable fishery, so we should all stop eating fish. Erin, can we have a sustainable fishery?
Of course, we can have sustainable fisheries, and our program helps deliver that. But it's not just our program. It's the suite of other actors. It's governments, NGOs, industry, all coming together in this multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder environment, working towards sustainability, achieving sustainability. So yes, absolutely, we can have sustainable fisheries.
Okay, let's finish with that note for the moment. And you're hearing currently from Erin Priddle, the Regional Director Northern Europe of the Marine Stewardship Council, from Rohan Currey, the Chief Science and Standards Officer, and from Camiel Derichs, the Programme Director of the MSC. So this is our last sort of 20-25 minutes or so. We're starting to look at some of the questions that have been sent in. And of course, by almost by definition, they're going to be critical of aspects of the MSC's work. One of the issues is the concern about bycatch, the possibility or the reality that the MSC is most concerned in the setting of its standards about the bycatch of potentially endangered or threatened species, but not just generally, because the priority is to maintain the sustainability of commercial species. So here's an example. A really bad example of bycatch. Icelandic lumpfish fishery apparently caught 900 seals, 269 harbour porpoises, and 5,000 seabirds in one season after it was certified. Rohan, or whoever, I mean, can you respond to that? Is that the case, and what's being done about it?
So that information came to light as part of the improvements the fishery had made to improve its gathering of information ahead of being assessed. And as a result of that information, the fishery was suspended. So in effect, that was the program working. It brought information to light that wasn't otherwise known. And then as a result of that, action was taken. And what's more, that fishery now has a very strong incentive to address that, because the market links that would be built associated with selling certified sustainable seafood will mean there's a very powerful incentive to address it.
And can it be addressed? I mean, realistically, in that fishery, is it possible to stop? Have we got? Is the technology there to stop the bycatch of that sort of volume?
There are many ways of mitigating bycatch. They depend on the gear type, and they depend on the kind of species that are interacting with the gear. So in some cases, it might be things like gear modifications. In some cases, it's different kind of setting practices. In some cases, it's excluding particular areas or times of day. There are a number of ways of addressing that, but the point is that fishery now has an incentive to address that problem, because if it doesn't, it won't be able to be recertified.
And this is, if I can come in here on this fishery, it's, this one was, I believe, was raised in the documentary as well, but I think this is really like the organization working in practice. There was bycatch issues in that fishery. That fishery worked with conservation groups like BirdLife International. They worked with the Icelandic government. I mean, they recognized the problem. They wanted to do something about it. Without a program like ours coming in and demanding that rigor, that fishery would probably still be, who knows, like kind of going about those operations. This is about education and science and, again, that multi-stakeholder environment all working together to try and resolve on an issue. I think there's another good example in Western Canada with the Pacific salmon, where actually there was an anecdote from a conservation organization there saying, when it was suspended, it actually, that didn't work because we didn't have an engagement platform any longer. MSC gave us that engagement platform. With fisheries bycatches, an inevitable, outcome sometimes. I think in the UK, these dogfish sightings, basically fishermen land on them and they have a traffic light system to basically, indicate when they've hit an event. And I think, again, that fishery's not certified, but it's about, bringing together that stakeholder environment to understand kind of when things are coming out of the water, documenting that, responding to that, working with the right people and resolving it. So I think, with that fishery, it was a good example of people coming together to resolve on that particular issue.
Camille, you want to add something?
I can add on the Icelandic lumpfish fishery that, to me, it signified an excellent example. As Rohan said, the fishery, when it was certified as a small-scale fishery, it was not having all perfect data. But through the risk-based framework, it managed to gain sufficient scores to meet the standard, but with conditions to collect more information on the interactions with endangered, threatened, and protected species. It placed observers on the vessels, collected data, observed they actually had an issue. Suspension was triggered, and that then triggered, because of a strong market demand, the government and the fisheries to do something about it. A new regulation came about. In terms of setting practices, the nets are now set in areas where the interaction likelihood is lower, where they can demonstrate that certain diving birds cannot have access to the nets because they're setting it deeper than previously. But the interaction likelihood is a lot lower, and the issue is much more under control. Is it perfect? Probably not. Do they need to continue to monitor it very carefully? Yes, and that's exactly what they're committed to do, and what this standard helps them being incentivized for. So I just think it's one of many examples. Another example comes to mind in developing world fishery for sea bob shrimp in Suriname, where the fishery working towards MSC full assessment recognized it had an incredible amount of bycatch, of juvenile snappers and groupers. For them to address it, they had to completely change their gears, make the turtle exclusive device not just mandatory, but actually used, include square mesh panels to allow small fish to escape, and they reduced bycatch rigorously, and that didn't just have the benefit for the bicorp stocks. It actually made the sorting work on board a lot easier. So the fishermen were making more money, and they bought into the practice of sustainable working. But these are just a couple of examples, but there's endless amounts out there.
Okay, let me turn on to another one, which is the whole issue of shark finning, or shark catch, really. Sharks, as we know, breed very slowly. They're being heavily depleted. In some cases, mako sharks takes 20 years before they breed. So depletion levels are very rapid, fed by the market demand from Asia. And as you know, I mean, if anyone doesn't know what shark finning is, it's the cutting off of the landing of the shark, the cutting off its fins, the throwing overboard of the shark, which will then die in the water, unable to do anything. Now, European Union legislation has been tightened over the years, so now sharks have to be landed with fins attached. And the claim is the MSC doesn't enforce a similar principle, despite this being legislation not simply in Europe but in many other countries too. It doesn't enforce it absolutely. You know, it allows loopholes. Rohan, are there loopholes?
So Chris, shark finning is abhorrent, and the MSC does not want shark finning to occur in any of the fisheries in our program. So we've taken a number of steps to address it. It's been something our board made clear for many years ago that this is something that we didn't want to see in the program. And what we've done is introduced a couple of sets of requirements to try to address it. One is that fisheries that have any shark finning instances that occur, those fisheries will be removed from the program unless the client, the fishery client, takes action to remove those vessels from the certificate. The reason why we've done that is because although a lot of people state that shark finning should be banned globally, it is not yet in all jurisdictions. So we needed to empower the fishery clients to deal with this, and it also enables them to deal with, for example, shark finning that might occur on a vessel where it's an isolated example, and they were able to deal with this directly and remove those vessels where those kind of things happen. It's a clear penalty for the vessels concerned. They can no longer sell as MSC certified. And in many cases, that will cost them market access and quite a bit of money in some cases as well.
Why, Rohan, do we keep getting the? I mean, I've got emails here that have been sent in during the course of the program, and I've got correspondence here of people keep citing examples of alleged alleged failures to enforce this policy.
So some of that predates when we introduced this set of requirements. Other instances that I've seen highlighted as examples are actually not part of MSC certificates. So in those cases, it might be activities that have occurred outside of certificates. The other policy initiative that we're putting in place for our standard review is exploring introducing fins naturally attached. And the only exceptions to that will be where there is a legal regime that introduces something that would deliver the equivalent outcome. And the reason for that is because the MSC program is not prescriptive, and there are other ways to manage your sharks and to make sure that you maintain a favourable status. And it also reflects the reality of fishing operations around the world. For those where fins naturally attached is introduced, in some cases where there are targeted, well-managed shark fisheries, and those do exist in various parts of the world, if you retain the whole body of a shark on board, it can spoil the rest of the catch. And so there are practical and logistical reasons why it's very difficult to always retain a whole shark. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have fins naturally attached policies where they make sense, absolutely. But in places where it doesn't, there are good alternatives, and they are usually associated with very high levels of observer coverage and other good management practices.
I hear you, but I was on the Fisheries Committee in the European Parliament back in 2003 when we first discussed this, and the Commission put forward some of the arguments that you have just expressed, and came back 10 years later to say, okay, we admit it, it's not good enough. We have to, of course, I won't take you longer on this, but the real issue is to stop the demand for shark fin soup, isn't it? I mean, so long as the Chinese market keeps demanding this and paying ridiculously high prices for something which tastes of nothing, apparently, sharks are going to get killed.
So the focus of the MSC program has been about evaluating the sustainability of the outcomes on the water. So ultimately, we're not prescriptive about how people use the fish. So that's up to the market to determine how they wish to use the fish. Our concern is if any shark is caught in an MSC certified fishery, is that sustainable? And what we've found is if you look around the world, there are multiple examples where people can manage shark fisheries with different methodologies other than exclusively relying on fins naturally attached. So that's why we're exploring the option we are. But it's not to say fins naturally attached isn't a good solution in many cases.
Erin, how often do you feel that MSC gets attacked by some of your environmental colleagues when really it should be governments that should be in the firing line. It's governments should be introducing legislation on some of these things. It's not a matter of a voluntary body, if you like, to have to be in the forefront all the time.
Well, I think many stakeholders highlight these issues.
I'm coming back to you, Rohan. It's that was to Erin.
Sorry.
Because Rohan worked for the government as well. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a role for both, and the regulatory process and the rigor that needs to go behind policy making has value and is necessary and needs challenge and rigor by NGOs. And I think that it's fine for NGOs to offer these criticisms around the MSC as well. I think it's fine. We should be able to have this conversation and a debate about different approaches. So I don't have an issue with that at all. And I can understand sometimes where, the strength of feeling lies. And often people come with different ideologies and different backgrounds around, how we're going to basically apply tools and solutions to the ocean's crisis that we're all struggling to deal with. And so I think, we come from different backgrounds, different experiences, and different ideologies. And I think that's okay, but it's about collaboration and finding ways to work together and to align to achieve ultimately what is a shared goal.
Okay, let me talk about the standards and the review of the standards. I mean, sorry, got a whole list of points I could go through. We're not going to have time, of course. But the standards review. I mean, okay, the criticisms come that the bar is not being set high enough. Then that you are currently undertaking a review of your standards, but the process allegedly is not sufficiently transparent and it's too slow. I mean, maybe this is, I understand if you're not actually agreeing to what people are saying, then they're going to find an objection to perhaps to the process. But you hear the criticism. Is this how do you improve your dialogue with the campaigners out there who share your objectives?
Is this one still for me, or are you directing it to Rohan?
Well, you have a quick go first, Erin, and then over to Rohan.
I think, again, coming from a consultation background, I think the MSC's consultation processes are good and transparent and open. And I mean, I don't work in this particular area. We have a whole team dedicated to this. But the amount of consultation that I have seen carried out with this particular fishery standard review, I think has been exemplary, and especially in this virtual world that we're living in. And I think the MSC's team of outreach colleagues across the globe are always available to take questions and conversations from the public on the standard, on the work that we do. So we always have an open door policy, and we've always been, I believe, transparent in the way that we've gone about any sort of policy change. I don't know why that's funny, Chris. I
can't say how many government spokesmen have come out with similar words in response to criticisms from the opposition. But it's just, I mean, okay, Rohan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. But I think the difference perhaps with some others that have said this versus what we're saying is we actually mean it, and we've got the runs on the board to prove it. We've listened. So when stakeholders have raised issues, those issues have been consulted on as possible policy solutions. So many of the things our stakeholders have told us over the years, and personally I've sat in many stakeholder meetings where these things have been discussed. Those ideas, those suggestions, those ways forward have been put forward, and we're consulting on them and exploring the alternative options. So we listen, we incorporate that in the proposals, we evaluate the consequences, and we put this through a governance process which is deliberately, intentionally independent, and also gives it an incredible amount of scrutiny. So we have a technical advisory board of world-class experts who review the technical merits of all of our proposals. Plus we have a stakeholder advisory council that represents all of the various sectors involved in our theory of change. So the people who are most closely associated and understand the consequences, the leaders in that sector sit around the table and discuss all of these in detail. And then finally, it goes to an independent board of trustees for evaluation. So at every stage in that process, there is sunlight, there is scrutiny, and there is a lot of thought and care. There's something like 25% of the world's fisheries are either in our program or working towards our fisheries standard as an objective when they're making fisheries improvements. That's a huge responsibility, and we take it very seriously. You wouldn't have a government that looks to make major changes on policy development just without any consultation, without any evidence to underpin it. We have to treat this seriously. The consequences are huge, and we want to make sure that we bring people with us, and that's why we've spent so much time engaging with stakeholders over the past few years in our standard review.
Yeah, you employ. I'm very conscious that you employ a lot of people, and you've got a lot of people who've made a lot of organisations, huge retailers, fish producers, fishermen who've made a major financial commitment to this. Now, if we're not promoting sustainability, then all that's wasted, and it shouldn't be happening anyway. But to make changes for the sake of making changes that could lead to the loss of jobs, the loss of some of that investment, is going to undermine the whole credibility of the organisation, and perhaps
there's real life consequences. And on top of that, there's also risk of perverse outcomes. And I think that's often what the well-intentioned stakeholder feedback cannot necessarily always have thought of the possible consequences of some of the ideas that are coming forward. That's not to say the stakeholders did not have a good faith engagement in the process. Of course they did. It's just our system is complex, fisheries are complex, and there are so many different jurisdictions around the world that look to manage their fisheries in different ways, and we need to find ways that are successful and work in all of those different permutations. But we want to make sure we get this right, because, again, the consequences of getting it wrong are we fail to achieve our mission and vision, and that would also be unacceptable. So we want to make sure we reflect this properly. People
wonder, though, I mean, trawling, for example. Trawling is regarded by many as deeply damaging, of course, to the seabed. And the European Commissioner has spoken out about how much he, frankly, would like to move away from it. I mean, MSC standards can still permit trawling, can they not?
They do permit trawling in our standard, and that's partly because the FAO only specifically excludes a couple of kinds of fishing activity that are just deemed to be completely unacceptable, those using poisons or explosives. Other than that, any fishing gear theoretically can be sustainable against the eco-labelling guidelines. So we've never excluded gear types. We're always more concerned about evaluating that gear type's outcome is consistent with our standard. And we have very rigorous habitat requirements that requires the avoidance of vulnerable marine ecosystems, and it requires the management of impacts that take place on many of the habitats that fisheries encounter. Those requirements were considerably elevated under our last standard review on the strength of feedback that we received from our stakeholders. So we listened, we reflect global best practice, and now fisheries are having to deal with that reality. In many cases, they're having to avoid areas they might not have avoided before, because this is now new information, and our level of performance that we might expect might be higher than what their management agency previously required. Okay. So it's an evidence of our theory of change playing out on the water.
So indeed, the bar may well be raised higher as evidence comes to light, insisting upon that must happen.
As it should.
Okay. So a number of organisations, as you know, have come together under the label On the Hook, and have listened to you calling for an independent review of practices. I mean, this has been called for, I think, for a couple of years. It's been repeated now. So what's the response to that from the MSC?
Well, I think Rohan's already outlined it. I mean, we engage regularly with the On the Hook campaign, and this call for an independent review had come up in the Sustainable Seas Inquiry back, I believe, in 2018. But, our response, and we're very happy to discuss it with them, but our response to that is that for the reasons that Rohan has just outlined around the rigor in terms of our governance bodies and the assurance systems that we have set up, combined to offer, I think, an incredible amount of rigor and diligence in terms of our own standards and operations. And I think that an independent review of the scale that the On the Hook campaign are seeking would not only be duplicative, it would also undermine the good work that's already taking place with the Fishery Standard Review, which we are required to undertake every 5 years according to these international benchmarking tools that we abide by. So we feel that this is happening, and we want On the Hook and other NGOs to engage with us through those engagement platforms, so we can take in that stakeholder feedback and incorporate it into our own evaluation systems.
Okay.
I don't know if Rohan wants to add to that.
I just wanted to, though, perhaps Rohan just respond to this. And it's just I mean, I read the latest letter from On the Hook to the MSC, and it emphasises that it believes in what the MSC is trying to achieve, and that it supports the MSC, and it doesn't want to undermine the MSC. And yet, it does strike me that, you know, like in some political parties I can think of, it's very easy for people to start turning upon their friends within the same grouping. And while the MSC says it doesn't want to undermine the credibility, while the campaigners say they don't want to undermine the credibility of the MSC logo, by trying to seek headlines saying it demands MSC address failures, it's undermining the credibility of the MSC logo, isn't it?
They've taken a certain approach through more of a business-to-business trade sector channels versus trying to splash headlines on the Guardian. So I think that's kind of what they meant there by that. And we've taken sort of dedicated engagement through one-to-one meetings with the On the Hook campaign as well. So since the Sustainable Seas Inquiry has closed, you know, we still kind of lead engagement through ad hoc meetings. Okay, just towards we finish off, and I'm sorry here, I'm looking at these questions that have come in, lots of detailed questions. I hope in a generic way we've answered, we've touched upon many of them. This webinar is intended to be the first of two, with a second in the autumn, because the MSC said, you know, we want to find a way of working with our critics, if you like, with other environmental organisations dedicated to achieving sustainability in the fisheries sector. And they wanted to explore that dialogue in the future. So we'll come back to that, and please keep a lookout for that. But Camiel, if I can turn to you to sort of finish here. I mean, look back on you've been with the MSC 15 years. And again, you look at the annual report, and it would seem that its activities are increasing rapidly. It's very encouraging. The number of products being MSC certified, for example, and licensed has driven forward rapidly. There's potential for growth for other parts of the world. I mean, you think MSC has a significant role to play in bringing about the global transformation of fishing that we all need to see?
Yes. Yes,
I suppose that's too obvious a question, really, isn't it? Yes. Okay.
Yes. For me, the fact that there is a standard, and that standard being used by management agencies, by NGOs that operationalize fisheries improvement projects, by fisheries representative bodies, cooperatives that themselves want to improve. They need a standard. This is a global codification of how good fisheries management looks like, how you take care of your stock, minimize your ecosystem impact, and organize good management. So that standard and being a robust standard based in global best practices that are actually applied and progress in scientific insight, that is there to stay. And the MSC, I think, is absolutely committed to maintain that best practice standard and system for that. So, yeah, I don't think what to say more about this.
Is there any magic wand that could be waved that will bring about a rapid improvement, or is it simply sheer hard work for another 25 years?
I believe so. I don't think that there are magic bullets that are going to tomorrow make the world a sustainable place in whatever commodity supply chain, and fisheries is no exception. Maybe it's even more challenging because we have, you know, underwater moving resources that are difficult to count. They don't stick to borders, and you have climate change that comes on top that makes it all even less predictive. So it is a complex, difficult system to maintain and to make sustainable. But what we've started by setting a global standard and a global platform where stakeholders can come together to jointly drive progress, I think is going to grow and is going to help generate impacts in the decades ahead. Okay. Will there be accelerators? Yes, I think technology is going to help a lot with this, both in the verification, and the MSC is anticipating to that by digitizing its operations, but also by means of collecting better evidence and data on fish stocks and interactions of fishing vessels with the ecosystem in which they operate, which helps to inform better management, make sure that better monitoring, compliance, and surveillance. Some of that is already part of our fishery standard review, where the evidence requirements are going to strengthen, where the monitoring, compliance, and surveillance component of standards going to improve. So we're anticipating that, and it's going to be a critical part, I think, of helping to accelerate impact.
Okay, thank you very much, Camiel. Right, well, we've reached the end of our programme, which of course has been about the work of the Marine Stewardship Council. You've been hearing from Camiel Derichs, the Programme Development Director, from Rohan Currey, the Chief Standards and Science Officer, and Erin Priddle, the Northern Director for the Europe region. We're going to come back in the autumn with a second webinar to discuss the work of the MSC, but also to try and reach out really and to discuss how we form partnerships and achieve greater cooperation to take forward the sustainability agenda. Copies of this webinar will be made available. They should be found on the Pedersen Public Affairs website, the Political Festival website, but I'm sure it'll be available through MSC too. So thanks very much for listening. You've all had your answer, you know, can fishing be sustainable? Yeah, fishing can be sustainable, but there's a lot of work to make sure that the rules are enforced if that's to be credible. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Chris.